Perfect. So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here, especially when it's so wonderful outside. Probably it's the best Saturday since we started the year. So today I'm going to be talking about the role of anxiety in cluster C personality disorders. Just to give you a little bit of information about me, I'm a psychiatry fellow at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. And initially, I was interested in anxiety disorders, but I guess when you join Sinai, you get enthusiastic about personality disorders, and yet here I am talking about anxiety in cluster C personality disorders. I don't have any conflicts of interest disclosed. So let's talk a little bit about cluster C. I guess we all know that cluster C are the so-called anxious and fearful cluster. And as you all know, it includes 3 different personality disorder: avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive. As we all know, the criteria in the DSM-5 has not really changed that much, but in general, just to give you a hint about every of these personality disorders, the avoidant personality disorder is characterized by a pervasive pattern of social inhibition, feelings of inadequacy, and hypersensitivity to negative evaluation, right? The dependent personality disorder is they have this strong need to be taken care of. And persons with obsessive-compulsive personality disorders, they are so preoccupied with rules, regulation, obsessed with perfection, maybe, right? So, again, as we heard here, the criteria in the DSM-5 for these disorders have not changed that much. And I'm actually glad that they survive and they are able to be still a personality disorder, because initially I think they wanted to cut them off. In terms of anxiety disorder, since I'm going to be talking about that, I want to just give you a few updates that happened in the DSM-5. The former DSM-4 category of anxiety disorders became 3 separate categories in DSM-5. The first one is anxiety disorders. The second one is the obsessive-compulsive disorder. This is no longer considered an anxiety disorder. And among this group, you can find OCD, body dysmorphic disorder, hoarding disorder, and others. And the third group, the third category is the trauma-related disorders that will have PTSD here. So basically, OCD and PTSD left the area of anxiety disorders, and 2 other disorders got upgraded. It's separation anxiety disorder and selective mutism. They used to be considered childhood-related disorder, and now they are inside this group of anxiety disorders. So we all know that there's a really, really high comorbidity. The data is really overwhelming. In general, there's a high co-occurrence of cluster C in individuals with anxiety disorders. It is estimated that up to 70% with patients with panic disorder, they also meet criteria for a comorbid cluster C personality disorder. And maybe the most controversial ones have been the relationship between social phobia or social anxiety disorder, as it is called now, and avoidant personality disorder. The comorbidity can be up to 90%, so it's kind of really alarming. And the co-occurrence between obsessive-compulsive disorder and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder can be up to 50%. In this slide, I included also a figure of this recent meta-analysis published by Freeburg, in which he basically collected information about the comorbidity of personality disorders and anxiety disorders. And you can see, no, there's no, oh, yes, oh, here. Yes, you can see that for social anxiety disorder, also known as social phobia, it's in this study they found that a comorbidity of 0.46, and it was very significant. I guess that in order to understand this specific comorbidity, the avoidant personality disorder and social anxiety disorder or social phobia, it's important to see what happened in some of the DSM-5, in some of the DSM prior to the DSM-5. They were both formally introduced in the DSM-3. And when they were first introduced, initially you couldn't have both. I mean, there was like a hierarchy, meaning that if you had social anxiety disorder or social phobia, you couldn't have avoidant personality disorder, where they were in 2 separate axes. But they were, when they launched the revised version of this DSM, they dropped these exclusion criteria. So after that, basically many people met then criteria for these 2 disorders, right? And this has been proven since DSM-3R to up until now. One of the reasons probably for this high comorbidity, they do have some overlapping criteria. those are the criteria for the DSM-4, but it hasn't changed that much. In general, they have this fear or feeling this scrutiny by others in the case of social phobia. And in the case of avoidant personality disorder, you can see that they are preoccupied with being criticized. That would be one of the criteria. The other one is like they avoid situation. They have this avoidant behavior, right? So this is common in the two disorders. And of course, it's sometimes hard to say what is what. They also share some personality traits. All anxiety disorders, they have this neuroticism. And as you can see here, they study different personality traits among different personality disorders. And in the case of the cluster C, you can see that in general, really high neuroticism. Not that much for obsessive compulsive, but definitely for avoidant and for dependent. And then there's a low extraversion, which can be probably translated into a high introversion. And also the openness to experience it was somewhat related to obsessive compulsive disorder. And they also have these common behavioral temperamental traits in which they are both, like they have this behavior of inhibition, of avoidance. So I guess like it is not surprising to see that they share some of the criteria, and probably that's what people get confused. Another thing that I guess that can explain this high comorbidity is that in general, DSM-5 share many of the psychometric limitations as other personality disorders because of the categories in which they were classified. And DSM-5 in particular, the reliability has been a little bit alarming, I believe. In the area of anxiety disorders, for instance, the most common, or one of the most common anxiety disorder is the generalized anxiety disorder, and as you can see, it's almost like on the top down on the list, meaning that it has a really bad kappa values, which is kind of alarming, again, because it's one of the most common anxiety disorders. In the area of personality disorders, it's not that bad. It seems like BPD is in a moderate situation, but in the case of obsessive compulsive personality disorder, the kappa values are not great. Of course, we don't have data of the other cluster C because there were too few patients who test reliability, but I guess that in other DSMs, the reliability for this specific cluster C was not as bad, ranging from 0.6 to 0.7 approximately. However, the fact that these two disorders co-occur, cluster C and anxiety disorders, they have actually significant clinical consequences, this comorbidity, because they have increased symptom severity. In general, people with comorbid cluster C and anxiety, the severity of the psychopathology is greater, and it has a detrimental impact on the course of anxiety disorders. In general, we know that individuals with cluster C who also have anxiety disorders, the course of these anxiety disorders is actually more negative. And we also know that there's a detrimental impact on the treatment of anxiety disorders, meaning that they respond worse to CBT or they respond worse to SSRI. But again, as Dr. Black pointed, this is like a little bit of a neglected area, so we don't really have a lot of studies proving, or a lot of randomized clinical trials proving this. So this is kind of like an area that we should definitely be applying for more grants or trying to get more funding if possible. So historically, in the case of social anxiety disorder and avoidant personality disorder, some researchers, many years ago, they used to think that they were basically the same thing, and it was a matter of severity, meaning that social anxiety disorder, in the past called social phobia, was like a less severe version of the avoidant personality disorder. So it was basically, they felt like, because of this high incidence between these two disorders and the substantial homology in between the criteria, basically they felt like it was the same thing, and that has been like something that has been accepted for a few years at least. And besides the clinical factors, another thing that they found that many authors said is that it's not only like the clinical factors, but the demographic and the socio-demographic factors are actually very common. So probably it's kind of the same thing. It's a kind of like a severity thing, right? However, later on, there was another hypothesis that came up. It was that they are completely separate disorders. And they were basing this hypothesis on the fact that they have qualitative psychopathological differences between these two disorders, specifically in various aspects of personality functioning. The area of identity, emotional avoidance, and relational problems. It was not a severity factor. It's like they are definitely different disorders. That's what they were defending. And in the case of the avoidant personality disorders, in general, they have this impoverished sense of self. They are aloof, they are detached, and they are very shy. And this is not criteria that they definitely share with people with social anxiety disorder. In general, they have a difficult to recognize emotions, and I read in some of the papers that they may be somewhat related to this cluster A in some of these ability to recognize emotions. And also, one of the main differences that many authors pointed in between these two disorders is the metacognition. In general, avoidant personality disorder, they have this compromised metacognition sub-functioning, the ability to identify one of the own inner states and to correctly recognize and identify the mental states of others. And in here, in this slide, I included this table in which some authors compare metacognition and interpersonal functioning among these two disorders. And as you can see, in general, the metacognition is a little bit better for social anxiety disorder, and there are definitely significant scoring differences in between interpersonal ambivalence, aggression, the lack of sociability. So that was part of the theory why they were saying that they were definitely different disorders. However, based on this information, many people right now are like, okay, so are they the same thing? Are they the separate? Where are we in terms of research? So it's important to point out that all the research that I presented up to date, it has been basically clinical research. Fortunately, we have advanced and we have now neurobiological markers, and I'll tell you more about it, but I guess it's important to say that thanks to this advance in medicine, I guess the neuroimaging studies, genetic studies have actually shed some light into this to know if this is or not the same thing. What does the neurobiology say? So I summarize here the few genetic studies that have been published regarding this comparison between avoidant personality disorder and social anxiety disorder. In general, we know that cluster C personality disorders are heritable, and we know that there are some genetic and environmental factors common in avoidant and dependent personality disorders. That's the study published in 2007. But it seems like they kind of mentioned that OCPD was kind of like in a different category in terms of like genetics and environmental factors. The same authors focused specifically later on avoidant personality disorder, and they saw that they reported a common genetic vulnerability between avoidant and social anxiety disorder in women. And they said that while they had these genetic commonalities, the environmental factors were different. However, it's important to highlight that in that study, it was a cross-sectional design, and also the sample size was a little bit small. So other authors have tried to replicate these findings. Isomura and his colleagues in 2015 did another study in which they evaluated social anxiety disorder and avoidant personality disorder, and basically they found that they were somewhat etiologically related, and that they also said that they may represent expressions of the same vulnerability. And something that came up in that study that I found particularly interesting is that they seem to get married a lot in between these two disorders. So they said that there was a strong marital concordance. So I guess it would be interesting to study the genetic loading of the offspring, right? But I found this particularly interesting. And recently, Torvik published a very robust study, and he used a longitudinal methodology, and the power was really high. And basically, he said that there are common genetic influences on social anxiety disorder and avoidant personality disorder that, despite are not identical, they are highly correlated. And also, he also found, contrary to the prior study from 2007, that the environmental factors are both stable and time-specific, because it's a longitudinal study, and they also contributed to the co-occurrence of the disorder. So it seems like the environmental factors are also somewhat related. So based on these findings, we can say that probably instead of talking about like a severity model or of a different disorders model, we have what we could call a phenotype model. We know that there's some common genetic and environmental abnormalities, and I guess that these findings will have to be replicated with gene-environment interaction studies that are becoming more common now in our field. And then the area of neuroimaging also, I tried to find the few studies that we have published in this matter. For social anxiety disorder, we have more neuroimaging studies, and we can see that there's like an alteration of the amygdala in general in the limbic system that is also common to avoidant personality disorders. In the task-related studies, there was a hyperactivation of the medial and parietal and occipital regions, and some of these studies were reporting reduced connectivity in these parietal and limbic and executive regions, which could mean that maybe the frontal lobe or maybe this executive network is stopping them, although it's kind of limited. And then they also found this corticolimbic model that they described. And I could say that maybe, although we don't have a lot of information or any study at all comparing neuroimaging of these two disorders, there are very, very, very few neuroimaging studies regarding avoidant personality disorder. And we have actually Dr. Koenigsberg here, who has studied habituation in avoidant personality disorder. And the few studies that we have, they're functional, some functional and some show that the amygdala is also hyperreactive. And it seems like, per Dr. Koenigsberg, there was no evidence of greater amygdala recruitment in patients during habituation, right? But we don't really know habituation in social anxiety disorder, so I guess we need to still do some more research in that area. But I believe that what is important about this slide is that we're showing that there are somewhat alterations in the limbic system, and I guess this could be something common in between two disorders, but again, this needs to be further studied and to see specifically the differences in functional and MRIs. So just to conclude, 16 minutes. So basically, there's a high co-occurrence of cluster B and anxiety disorder that may be explained by these overlapping criteria, common personality and behavioral traits. And it's also important to think that at one point they were mutually exclusive, but then the DSM-3 revised version decided to drop this criteria, and since then it's been a little bit chaotic. It's important to consider the clinical consequences, because we know that people who have both and who meet actually criteria for both, they do much worse and they respond worse and they have a higher likelihood of relapsing. And then we've had these two hypotheses that people were like, no, this is like a severity issue, this is like a separate disorder issue, but we know that based on the neurobiological studies, we know that probably we're talking about the spectrum hypothesis with commonalities in genetic and environmental factors. Thank you very much.